My name is Jocelyn Bailey. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Social Design Institute at UAL. So the agenda for today is that I'm going to say a few words of introduction, and then we're going to hear from our three speakers, and I'll mention in a moment who those people are. They're each going to speak for about 10 or so minutes, and then there's going to be a few minutes after each of their presentations for immediate questions to them. I'm going to then chair a panel discussion between the three of them, and as part of that, we'll also open up to questions from and contributions from you. So hopefully that will be quite a lively discussion between us all, and then we're finishing at 4 o'clock UK time. So I've already said who I am. We're going to be hearing today from three other researchers who, like myself, have also been in their doctoral research work, looking and in their practice and in other research, looking at the field of design in the public sector and design design being done in, with, for, in the context of government. So that's the kind of the general theme. We've all come at this from different angles, and we're all located in different places around the world. So you're going to hear a diverse mix of perspectives on this topic today. Scene setting, both of the wider context for this discussion and why we thought it was important to hold this event and to sort of open up the conversation we're having today. And I thought I would start with a little bit of history. In somewhere around the early 2000s, there were some developments in both discourse and practice in the ways design was being talked about or talked up, and the things designers were doing, where the methods, tools, and even thinking styles of designers were put forward as a new and better way of working for the public sector, whether that meant engaging with citizens differently, developing and delivering public services, or creating new policies. Whereas, once upon a time, if you were talking about design in relation to the public sector, you might have been assumed to be talking about the design of buildings, or perhaps those public communications campaigns of sort of mid-century, your country needs you, and what to do in case of a nuclear blast. But today, or in this new discursive formation, a new species of design was being talked about, which was symbolized by things like post-it notes, flip chart paper, and meeting rooms full of clusters of people with their sleeves rolled up, surrounded by a creative mess. New design teams, innovation labs, and design agencies directing their work at the public sector began to pop up across Europe and beyond. Research funding and public money was earmarked for theorizing and advancing this emergent field. Early attention to this phenomenon from academic researchers, people like Guy Julia, Liz Moore, and Cynthia Webber, among others, was actually quite critical, inclined to view these developments as a strategy that had more to do with political mood, trends in public administration, or the need of certain design organisations to make a case for their own value to government. However, those early critiques have now been outnumbered by a much larger body of research buttressing the field, which takes the practice more or less at face value and seeks to explain and account for it. An academic field of research has therefore emerged as a kind of commentary on the world of practice. So our conversation today is situated in that world of academic research studying the real world phenomenon, but we are coming at it from a particular angle today, and I want to say a few things about why I think this is an important angle. My own engagement with this world began when I was working for an organisation called Policy Connect that ran something called the All-Party Parliamentary Design Group. And when I was there, I was involved with writing a number of reports and papers that effectively lobbied for design as an essential capacity for governing. My engagement continued as I began a PhD seeking to research this exciting new frontier in design practice. And as part of that, I found myself working for a design consultancy, actually delivering this kind of work for public sector clients. And so I was living with a kind of split personality of researcher on the one hand and design consultant on the other. And I experienced a sense of unease and also a sense of curiosity on two fronts. First, it seemed to me that as designers and design advocates, we really didn't understand in any meaningful way what we were busy doing. And I don't mean at the superficial level of how to run workshops, but at a deeper level of the political chessboard we had wandered onto. And second, I could see relatively little in the world of academic research that was addressing or shedding light on the things that I found troubling as a practitioner and curious as an academic. I actually didn't quite know what it was that I was looking for, but I did know that a lot of what I was reading really wasn't scratching the itch I was feeling bothered by. A lot of time was spent talking about quite a narrow set of things, some of which, as a design consultant, I could see relatively little empirical evidence for, if I was being brutally honest. And at the same time, there were other kinds of questions that were just not being asked at all. The research somehow appeared to be obscuring as much as it revealed. So I started reading outside of design, looking at things like critical management studies, critical anthropologies of policy and development, and some good old-fashioned cultural and social theory, people like Michel Foucault, Pierre Bourdieu, Bruno Latour, Judith Butler, and so on. From this, I learned that there are some fairly well-established ways of going about critical research, and particularly critical research of a world of applied practice, even if these at the time were rarely taken up in the world of design research. So the observant among you will have noted that the title of today's event is Critical Research Perspectives, and I want to explain what critical means here. Importantly, it doesn't necessarily mean finding fault with or just being negative about design. It means, first of all, questioning the automatic assumption that the point of research is to support or advance the interests of practice. This is often called anti-instrumentalism. This doesn't mean locking oneself away in an ivory tower and writing obscure things that only two other academics might understand. It just means recognizing that the priorities and concerns of academics might be different to those of practitioners. And simply that it is just quite constraining to the spirit of inquiry to always have to have one eye on producing something that can be applied and operationalized by designers. The second element of criticality is an intent to do something which is called denaturalizing the object of research. This basically means questioning or opening up that which is assumed or taken for granted, destabilizing the things we think are true or natural or normal, because those are precisely the things that will have been consolidated in our minds in that way as a result of the operations of power. The third element is reflexivity, or an acute awareness of one's own role and influence in the construction of knowledge. And fourth, which is a common theme to all of the above, is about recognizing the constitutive relationship between power and knowledge. Which and whose accounts become authoritative or naturalized is a question of power. Knowledge itself is a form of power at work. And there are, of course, advantages to be had, i.e. power, by adopting and regurgitating certain accepted and dominant ideas. Engaging with this account of criticality has helped me crystallize a particular problematic for design research, which is that we have developed specific ways of speaking and thinking about design, both in general and in this context, that sort of act like mental guide rails. To take perhaps the most obvious example of this at work, if you examine a phrase like, "I believe in the power of design," or "design for public good," or "the promise of design for public policy," what's implied by all of these formulations, what is naturalized, to use the term I've just introduced, is that design itself is an inherently good thing. I'll say this again, as I think it's as important and perhaps actually the central point that I want to make. There is a deeply naturalized truth in design research and discourse, and in common parlance, that design is an inherently good, desirable, beneficial thing. I don't think it's reaching too far to say that most of us working in design, whether as practitioners or researchers, are doing so because we do think there is something valuable about design. However, this can also sometimes have the flavour of unreflective evangelism, which for me sets a sceptical alarm bell ringing. In critical terms, we are looking at an idea that has been normalised and naturalised to the point that speakers don't always recognise it as a position they're inhabiting. We can see power at work here in the ways this idea is accepted, in the ways it produces things like knowledge, and in how it constrains or delimits other things. For example, in research, it channels inquiries down a specific path, and it makes other questions seem not relevant or even not imaginable. If design is assumed to be good, and it's primarily understood as a useful tool for government, then the sorts of research questions that make sense are to ask how and why is it useful, to ask where and in what context it can be usefully applied, to determine the barriers to its use, and to make recommendations for advancing it further. It does not make sense, on the other hand, to ask if design might be amiss, or if it might be doing something other than being useful, or if it might not be design at all, but something else that has adopted the language of design. In terms of practice, the naturalized assumption that design is inherently good can lead to the silencing of critical voices in debate. Saying certain things becomes taboo. And it also does something to how we think about ethics and politics as practitioners. Simply put, if you're doing good design, you must be doing good. These kinds of insights are only possible, though, if we establish a degree of critical distance from practice. And this can be hard to do when most of us who are researching design are also caught up in practicing it in some way. One way of achieving this can be to switch the disciplinary lens, to look at design through the eyes of a historian or using the lenses of political science or cultural studies. This might mean switching discipline yourself, or it might mean collaborating with others, or being open to insights that don't at first make sense. But I think it's worth, it entails some work, but I think it's worth the effort. First of all, I think it's probably the only way that we can more deeply and reflexively understand what we're busy doing, both as people who do design and people who speak and write about it. And second, I think asking a different set of questions with a different set of lenses is necessarily more likely to lead to original insight. For example, taking a historical view allows one to place the recent wave of design discourse in a longer history of design promotion from at least the early 20th century. Taking a genealogical stance allows you to connect co-design, which is prevalent in this field, either to the coercion of religious participation or the liberation of political participation. Looking from the point of view of political history or public administration might point to a connection between arguments for design and dominant political fashions and narratives. And taking a Foucauldian stance might suggest that one of the main things being produced in this new field is a new kind of designing subject, civil servants reimagining themselves as creatives and designers reimagining themselves as public sector change agents. In saying all of this, I'm not arguing that there's no place for a more straightforward approach to theorising design for government, for treating it as a technical capacity and trying to improve it. That is, of course, a necessary and worthwhile endeavour. But I do think it needs to be complemented by a plurality of other perspectives. We easily reach the limits of what can be learned if we only wear the instrumentalised goggles of design practice. And there are marginal gains to be had by asking and answering similar questions over and over again. As a matter of principle, isn't there a role for academics other than lobbying for the interests of design? And wouldn't greater diversity in academic work be a good thing? So, the purpose of today's discussion is to give some space and airtime to a diverse range of academic readings of design for government, which come from different disciplinary locations and mobilise a range of different theoretical standpoints and research practices. Anka, Azar and Chad will talk us through their respective approaches and the insights they have gained, which I'm sure will provide us all with some food for thought. And today's event is also an opportunity for us all, as an extended community of practice, to articulate some things and discuss some things which might normally be silenced or considered heretical in the optimism-fueled world of design. So that's my little introduction over. I'll now introduce our speakers in the order in which they're going to speak, and then I'm going to hand over to the first of them to tell us what they think. So, Anka Grindel is a research associate at the Institute for Cultural History and Theory at Berlin's Humboldt University, a member of the Cluster of Excellence Matters of Activity, and part of the international research collective Governing Through Design. She completed her PhD in politics from the New School for Social Research in New York, and Anka is joining us today from Berlin. Azar Aji is an independent designer and PhD researcher. Her doctoral research, which is undertaken between the University of Manouba and the University of Nîmes, has allowed her, among other things, to question the practice of design in different cultural contexts. Azar is joining us today from Paris, I believe. And Chad Story is a researcher and designer currently working at Coast Capital, a British Columbia-based financial cooperative, and also teaching at George Brown College in the Bachelor's of Experience Design programme. His PhD, which he completed a couple of years ago at York University, explored how design-based methods operate to promote, safeguard, and circulate neoliberal rationality within the public sector. And Chad is joining us today from Toronto. Okay, so I'm now going to hand over to Anka to kick us off. After her presentation, there'll be a few minutes for questions directly to Anka, and then we'll go on to hear from Azar and then from Chad. Okay, Anka, over to you.
All right, great. Let me share my screen with you. Okay, so thank you so much, Jocelyn, for the great introduction. So I'm coming from this, to this question of design and government, not as a practitioner at all, actually, but as a political scientist. My PhD was in political science, and I'm really not in the practice of design, but I'm looking at it kind of from the outside in. That being said, my approach to study design and government is actually not from the perspective of design at all, but rather from the perspective of government itself, right? And generally, my work is genealogical. That is, I'm trying to trace, conditions of possibility and the conditions of acceptability for design and government. So what I mean by that is that I ask a more general question. So why on earth, right, can we find designers, right, without any formal political administrative training in government at all? And I think that we shouldn't take that fact for granted, but actually we should try to understand, right, what the kinds of political demands are that to which designers are attempting to offer a response, but also the kinds of political practice that are being generated by or opened up by or even foreclosed by design. And so for me, for obvious reasons, and Joss already mentioned Foucault, genealogies are really useful in doing that kind of denaturalization because they destabilize those kinds of ideas that we typically take for granted. So I'm less interested in framing this kind of work in terms of established critical theories, like a critique of neoliberalism or capitalism, because I actually think that those kinds of ideas and those kind of theories actually overdetermine, the kinds of work we see being done in all these really different places in the world. And of course, there's a connection between them, but that's not always immediately obvious. So let me go to the next slide. All right. So I'm not going to talk about my PhD research, just completed a couple of years ago as well, but I'm actually, I'm going to talk about a little bit more about what I'm doing now in my postdoc and where this particular kind of work coming out of my PhD has taken me. So I'm going to talk about a very particular strand that I'm arguing we can see in design, which is the orchestration of conflict. Now that sounds like a really strange thing, right? Like conflict is not something we immediately associate with design. And it's not a straightforward term at all, actually. it's also not a term that's a government favorite, right? Like people in government don't really, especially in public administration, don't like to talk about conflict in that sense. And again, right, it's not particularly popular among designers either, but bear with me here. So my recent work really develops this kind of genealogy of conflict orchestration. So for such a genealogy, that I'm interested in the generation and structuration of ostensibly conflictual situations. That is a simulation of a particular kind of conflict. And for that, I return to the first half of the 20th century and trace, right, philosophical debates and practical programs that have, proposed some kind of way to deal with a newly appreciated sense of uncertainty. And so what I'm finding in that work, and that's from the 1920s all the way to the 1960s approximately, is that there is a particular kind of diagnosis of complex problems, right? Today we talk about in terms of wicked problems, which is something else, work that I've done in the past, and that kind of diagnosis constituted kind of like absolute limits to knowledge, and particularly absolute limits to technical expertise. But it was also a diagnosis of uncertainty, that in complex situations, one simply couldn't easily extrapolate future events and future developments from past data. Now, these kinds of theorists and practitioners that I'm tracing then reflected on the kinds of tools that they had available to them historically, primarily, these kinds of linear mathematical tools. And these kinds of mathematical solutions were actually deemed much too limiting and really inadequate to deal with these kinds of complex scenarios, complex situations. And so what they did, and again, this is just very schematically the logic of what I'm tracing, is what they did then is produce or propose a set of procedures to deal with these kinds of situations. Rather than expert knowledge or specific forms of expert knowledge, they proposed a set of procedures that weren't necessarily generalizable, but that could be applied to different kinds of situations. So let me give you a glimpse of what that kind of work is taking up. After the war and in the early Cold War, this thought really accelerated, particularly in these kinds of, think tanks that existed, all across the US. Some of you may know the RAND Corporation is particularly prominent in that. And the people that I'm tracing, thought about situations that involve multiple actors that pursue different goals. And they wanted to know which actions would be taken by these actors, which wasn't easily predictable. This kind of form of prediction, predictability, and forecasting really turned out to be this really obstinate task. So they argued that what one needed to do was not to rely on very specific forms of expertise, but rather to generate procedures that allowed for the simulation of conflict in these situations. And these kinds of methods were, for instance, the Delphi method, scenario planning, or wargaming, many of which were developed at RAND. So in these kinds of new methods, procedures, conflict itself, which was simulated through this variety of different forms of gaming and questionnaires and so on, conflict itself became a source of knowledge in which tacit and intuitive knowledge could be rendered visible and recordable, in which this kind of form of situated knowledge, we would say today, following Donna Haraway, would become intelligible in the first place. And these new procedures really, that's the most fascinating thing about it, relied on physical modeling. This is what you can see in the images here. Physical modeling, like sometimes the setup of whole game rooms, and you see this in the wargaming examples here, kind of physical props, cards, all kinds of things, visual representation techniques such as cognitive maps and all these different forms that weren't quite linear mathematical tools at all, And the demand was that a group of participants, which were ideally, as diverse as practicable, kind of practice that conflict and act it out. So the issue was, of course, that conflict could easily spiral out of control, right, and become untenable. So the trick of these procedures was to simulate and generate actually enough conflict to gather information, but to place enough constraints on them, enough rules on them, so that this kind of conflict wouldn't spiral out of control. Now, where does this leave us with design? These methods were later taken up in the 70s and 80s in planning and policy spaces in the US and in Europe, actually. And my argument here is not so much that these methods sort of gradually transformed into design, right? We see a lot of similarities between the kinds of methods, these kind of props that are used in design today in public sector design specifically, and the kind of procedures that were suggested in the past, in very different spaces, right? In the relation of bombing, bombing forecasting, of like really Cold War problems. So my problem again isn't that these things are related in any kind of linear fashion, but rather my point is that we can see a kind of continual engagement in government with the kind of procedures that deal with these complex, right, wicked problems. And that B, design was actually able to move into a space already carved out. And in that space, offer a kind of similar promise, right? That these kind of specific procedures that have been developed in design, and that certainly have some kind of relationship to the sort of Cold War methods, that these kind of offer the same kind of promise that wicked problems, complex problems could be dealt with procedurally. And yet, right, this kind of tradition, and I use tradition with a bit of a grain of salt, in design remains largely implicit. So let me quickly go to my last point. Because I think that we need to move towards an appreciation of conflict in design and in government, and not see it as something that's necessarily always disruptive. It can be, and it should be, but it doesn't always have to be. So this is just a few points on why conflict maybe should be taken seriously in design as an analysis, as a tool for analysis, but also, right, like as perhaps a challenge to practice. So conflict in the kind of tradition that I'm tracing has been taken up as a form of information, right? Like as a source of vital information in these otherwise intractable situations. Conflict also points us to pluralism. That is, conflict between different social groups and individuals has been used to generate diverse and situated knowledges, which otherwise would remain marginalized, excluded, right? And of course, conflict as politics. Now, this seems obvious and kind of straightforward, but I don't mean this in the kind of, right, radical democracy sense in which conflict is always disruptive, always eruptive, and the kind of foundation to politics, but I mean it in a very different way, right? That conflict is kind of necessary if we want to imagine like multiple possible futures. In the sense of politics, that takes it up as, right, generating or in a collective search rather for futures that we may share, although we don't necessarily all agree with them. So yeah, for more information, I just recently published an article on the history of wicked problems, which deals with very similar issues. So I'd invite you to look at that and read it. It's open source, so anybody can read it. And yeah, I look forward to questions and comments. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Anka. That was brilliantly interesting. The challenge of that kind of genealogical approach is how does one stumble upon these connections? Because it's a very sort of compelling argument, and one can see the kind of, you know, the narrative and the connections, but it's something I've also found in my own research, that occasionally you just come across something and you think, oh, that's interesting, that's a sort of odd connection, but it's also sometimes it feels a bit serendipitous. And so I'm just wondering what your approach strategy has been.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that that's a really good question, right? That we have to grapple with all the time. Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I would say is that genealogy isn't history, right? It isn't historiography. So in a way, the connections are serendipitous. Yeah, of course, because I'm not trying to do a very sort of, comprehensive history of the field. That's not what genealogy is, right? And at least not in the Foucauldian tradition. But the other thing that I will say is that what I'm doing is genealogy maybe more from the perspective of a kind of anatomy of these practices. So I am trudging through the archives, right, and trying to find connections. And that's like simultaneously really exciting because you find all these people that know each other, right, and that informed each other's work and that influenced each other. And yet, right, at the same time, that's a minor, and it sounds like a minor thread in this kind of history of right, perhaps something we might call a kind of technical democracy, right? It's certainly something that hasn't been very pronounced up until now. And maybe the point of this genealogy then is to again, right, render intelligible the kind of conditions of possibility for this moment of emergence, perhaps that we're witnessing right now, in which really design becomes very established in government, right? Like it's really a point in which, I mean, my God, the EU has this massive new initiative, like the new European Bauhaus, that is just promotes design on this massive scale that even 10 years ago was completely unimaginable. So yeah, that is a sort of like quick answer to that for now.
So there's also a couple of questions in the chat. So Justina, who I think is probably in Norway right now, says, do you have any thoughts about ways of putting the focus on designing for conflict in cultures that reinforce consensus and oneness, and where conflict is often interpreted automatically as unproductively disruptive?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I will say before I answer that question is that my work isn't normative, actually. So, and perhaps that's kind of like a regular. Sorry, I've been overworked for a long time. It's kind of rigorously self-limiting in the sense that I'm really not offering remarks on what one should do. But the other thing that I will say on consensus, actually, that it's a really complicated thing. So one strand of the tradition that I'm tracing, specifically the Delphi method, right, actually was generating conflict at the same time as it was trying to also find a way to generate consensus, but not consensus through discussion. It was actually a very strange form of discussion where it was anonymous and it kind of like, they call it a discussion or debate through questionnaire, in which then a consensus was generated through statistical means. So for culture, I mean, the other thing that maybe perhaps I should say about that, and maybe that goes towards answering the question a little bit more, is that, right, like the history that I'm tracing is primarily Western, right? It happened in Europe, it happened in the US, right? But I'm really looking at connections between the US and Germany, most importantly. Some of my other work will also go into Scandinavia and into the UK, actually. But this particular work on conflict and conflict orchestration really takes a particular kind of like post-war connection, and pre-war connection between Germany and the US. So for other places, I would encourage you to look at, the ways in which, the Delphi method has been taken up all over the world. Actually, it's really massive, especially in sort of like business management. Yeah, that's, I guess that's the best answer I can give to that immediately.
And I think that also, so we might pick up on that a little bit in the panel discussion as well, about the kind of, the sort of this specificities of practices to different places.
Exactly.
So there are another couple of questions which I'm just going to kind of leave sort of hanging, because I think we need to move on to Azar. But Lara asks, how do you ensure that the mechanisms to contain conflict don't become too controlling and therefore eliminate moments that require risk? which is what often allows a design process to thrive and be effective. And I think there is something interesting in there about the kind of, you know, the controlled creativity,
Totally, yeah.
which is interesting. And then Brian asks, or says, my observation has been that designers are seen as more neutral than other professions, and so can land in the middle of situations where others may not get invited, as Trojan horses, perhaps. And do you think how design is perceived from the outside is part of what enables that? Okay, so I'm just gonna, I'm gonna sort of leave those hanging in the air, and perhaps we can come back to them in the sort of discussion at the end. So, and thank you very much to Josina and Lara and Brian for those questions. So, Azar, are you ready to for me to hand over to you?
Yeah, thank you, Jocelyn. It's a little bit difficult to talk after Anka presentation. So I will discuss about, you know, talking about conflict and the cultural aspect that Anka also reflected last minutes. So I will introduce myself. I'm Azar Aji, and I am a designer and researcher from Tunisia, based in Paris. And I am a researcher in Nîmes University and Manouba University in Tunisia. So my presentation will talk globally about my work as a designer in a cultural context, very specific context, which is the new Tunisia after the revolution, or what is called the spring, the Arab Spring events. So I will reflect from my accumulated experiences in public sector innovation through design projects, but also from my project-grounded research in university. And I will talk about what design practices in non-Western culture, like Tunisia, when design is not as popular as in Europe or in Europe, and not used as often in public institutions. So, for example, in Tunisia, it's not very popular that design is deployed in public institutions, in public policies, or even in public services. So even there is no initiatives that have been initiated by the governments or public authorities. And there is just some initiatives that are initiated from designers or cultural structures. So design is taught in Tunisia basically in some of fine art schools, and there is only one school that teach design in Tunisia, where I had some courses and teach some courses there. So design is perceived as the production of graphics, of furniture, of products. So the object of my intervention here is to show how a designer, a woman and a Tunisian local designer can intervene with and for with local authorities in Tunisia in order to help municipalities improve participatory processes in order to get population and citizens involved in the local and political life. So for that, for example, in the political context, participatory democracy procedures are deployed in local municipalities. So my work there was, how can we improve those processes, and how we can have, before trying to do this, how we can get some sense and significations about and meaning about what concepts and abstract concepts like democracy and participation emerge from the fieldwork. So our work basically was trying to deploy a participatory approach with the community, learning community, which has actors like elected people, administration people, citizens, civil society members, and try to have this participatory approach to understand the context and the situations, and to visualize and represent some complexities and paradoxes about this transitional period that the local context is living. And then trying to imagine some possible scenarios for public participation. Our work, reflecting on all the process, our work consisted on translating processes from translating, for example, concepts, abstract concepts from the abstract to how people feel and sense and think about when we talk about democracy, when we talk even about design. What are the meaning that emerge and that are attached to human experiences, that attach to public participation, for example, and democracy. The result for this meaning production was very interesting, because it reveals how much and how many imaginaries emerge in how people participate, and it's about defining participation as a mechanism, or as collective experience, as more than just a sum of procedures. So which is very interesting is it showed that even democracy and participation as political concepts are very new to Tunisia, but that doesn't mean that the Tunisians that don't have the culture of participation. So the imaginaries that of participation that emerge from cultural activities, from the domestication of public spaces, how people give the operations of care to public spaces, the formal and informal conversations and interaction between people in popular coffee shops or on other public spaces. So the other work that we did as a designers is produce and reveal, and it's a work of representation, how we can represent complexity, how we can recognize paradoxes in order to have sharing, understanding about the situation, but from multiple point of views. I just want to after describing a little bit the process of our work, I want to show also the limitation of our work in this unique context, which is about we can't work if there is no prerequisite, something that already is, like, for example, the space where we can act, where we can intervene, some community or community from which we can really work with, and to have this legitimacy to be there and to act like a designer and to be taken seriously. So in some cases we didn't have the possibility to intervene or neither to act, because design, it's not known, and they don't see that we have the legitimacy to act there. Second, we have some challenges as democracy. For example, we ask the same questions, and we have the same challenges. It's about inclusion, it's about who is there in the table, it's about the quality of deliberation, the quality of the conversation. So in some cases we were able and pushed to try to continue working and assuming that we can't get more people around the table. The limitation of the design in this context is too difficult to position ourselves as power dynamics between two systems that don't speak or don't interact, but also they choose to ignore each other's, which is about the political class and the community and the citizen community. And we had we find ourselves trying to choose sides. In which side should we position ourselves? So is it in the place from trying to improve the procedures, to improve the control of the authorities, or are we trying to create an environment and conditions for activism to the community? So it was very interesting but challenging to have the right place from which we can intervene. So yeah, that's what I want to share for now, and I'm waiting if there's any question, Jocelyn.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, I think that question of whether what one is about is sort of enabling control or enabling resistance or something else is a really interesting one. And it was just yeah, so fascinating listening to what you were talking about there, particularly around doing the work of representing complexity and paradoxes, and sort of sharing and translating, and then how that relates or doesn't relate to what Anka was just talking about, the orchestration of conflict, and how design's kind of playing into a space that's already been created in government for the orchestration of conflict. So you're kind of between France and Tunisia, and what would you say are the differences in how participation as a concept is understood in those two places?
Yeah, it has been just 1 year that I'm almost 1 year that I am here, but I think that the last presidential, campaign, it tells so many things about, even when I watched the debate between the two candidates, it was how design can facilitate the debate, the conversation, the architecture of the debate, how there is there's some, even when the architecture, you say how designers has designed the architecture, it was you see this cleavage or this separation and between two sides, and it was very clear even how there is the journalist and the president and the other candidate, and it was how also design can also from these artifacts, how can create conditions for conversation, for horizontal conversation, for debate, for even pluralism, even if we aren't, we don't share the same, but there is also a space for plural and multiple opinions. So I think that there's another culture in Tunisia, because there is something that when after the revolution, there's this idea of euphoria of changing everything, but we have already something that we can build on. There's some culture of autogestion. How can I say autogestion? There we have some experiences of communities that govern themselves well, and we have this inheritage in our culture, and we have some solidarities that are here, and there are other modes of governing together, and And I think that there are so many things to do from this experiences that we can accelerate or amplify and try to experiment. And what is very, very paradoxal, it's when we didn't have, regulation, when we don't have the frame, there was an opportunity for people to experiment in local level. There was experimentations about participatory budgeting. There is an experimentation about led by civil society, and there's experiments about your municipality hors les murs, beyond the municipality in the public space. So there were in the absence of laws on frameworks, there is something that has flourished about experimentation, about changing positions, about daring and courage to do something with different stakeholders. Yeah, self-organized. Exactly.
Oh, yeah, okay. Great. So there's also, Sana has asked in the chat about whether you could give an example to explain the complexity between government and citizens. I might just, again, sort of leave that sort of hanging. Perhaps we can come back to talking in a bit more detail. I can also see that Patrizia has put a question in the chat about, I guess it's quite a long question, but asking sort of who critical research perspective serves. So I think we might also save that for the panel discussion at the end, because I think that'd be an interesting one to tackle all together. Okay, so thank you very much, Azar. That was great. So we're now going to go to Chad to hear from him.
Awesome, thanks for that. Already some really fantastic conversations and lots of really great ideas. I just wanted to take a few minutes just at the outset just to kind of position myself relative to, I think, the conversation that we're going to have today, but also just to give you some context around who I am as a designer and as a researcher, because I think that very much informs your, in the spirit of reflexivity, thinking about how I conduct and do research. So the first thing I wanted to acknowledge is that, so I'm located in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, which is the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And I'm situated on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. And I acknowledge that, and it's important for me to do that because I think in Canada, we're going through a process of reconciliation, albeit sort of problematic and slow and maybe not progressing as quickly as it should be. But I think as a designer and as someone who participates in these kinds of critical dialogues is to be mindful of the processes of colonization and how they show up, not only in my work, my daily work as a designer, but I think more broadly within the profession. And so I just wanted to call that out. I think it's an important way for me to kind of position myself relative to the conversation. And then I think just to echo a point that Jocelyn made at the outset. So I am a practicing designer. I work in design. I do experience design and I teach design. And I'm also a critical researcher. And so I find myself sort of always in this awkward position or place so that I straddle practice. So sort of the trials and tribulations of doing design in the wild and the day-to-day and the nuances that are associated with that. And then a researcher that tries to, while doing this work, maintain that kind of critical distance as much as possible. And it's this very awkward position that I always find myself in and continue to kind of navigate in the work that I do. And then I think just to give you a sense of where my work or the research, the critical work that I do is situated relative to kind of other research activities. I think what I'm interested in is the close proximity to, or what I would say, I essentially trace the entanglements of design practice, theory, and knowledge, and its relationship to capitalism. And I think being able to articulate these kinds of pairings helps to identify the kind of political subjects and political forms that emerge from these pairings. So what kinds of subjects are produced, for instance, when a designer works with a a policy expert. So if we think about that in the context of public sector design, and it's very interesting. And then more specifically, I'm really interested in the different kinds of design specialisms that are really concerned with reconfiguring public institutions. So public sector design and then public sector innovation more broadly. And really, it's really an intention to kind of remake those institutions in the image of the marketplace. So that kind of gives you a sense of who I am, where I'm coming from, and where my research is kind of situated. And then in terms of the methods that I tend to use, so I very much appreciate and have done practice-based research, so looking at design through research, but I tend to kind of rely more heavily on, I guess you could say, traditional social science methods, so observation and interviews and case studies and things like that. And so the dissertation research that I did very much drew upon those things. So that kind of gives you a sense of who I am, the kinds of knowledge that I'm interested in, how I also produce knowledge as a researcher. So to give you a sense of the kind of research, so Canada is an interesting place when it comes to design. I always think it's probably about 10 or 15 years behind what's happening in, I always use the United Kingdom as sort of as a benchmark. And I noticed that in 2010, I was a practicing designer at the time, that there was a widespread sort of use of design methods and design thinking specifically, a kind of managerial form of design was being taken up within public sector institutions in Canada. For folks that are, follow the work of Roger Martin, for instance, design thinking was really big. The Rotman School of Management is based in Toronto. And so there was this real kind of interest in the use of managerial forms of design, particularly in public sector innovation. And then just to echo another point that Jocelyn said, it's not that Canadian public sector institutions had never engaged with design or participated in design. There were many attempts, particularly in like the 1960s and 70s, to establish professional bodies and institutions. Design was seen as an important part of developing industrial policies in Canada. The design was used, graphic design and graphic communication was used for many public sector communication campaigns and things like that. So it wasn't that design is a completely new or novel thing to Canadian public sector institutions, but more specifically, what was interesting is the use of this very specific variation of design to solve problems. And so the use of design thinking techniques, these ideas of working fast, agile, in an agile format, et cetera, were relatively new and novel and still kind of remain to be the case in Canada. And so what I wanted to understand is what was going on. I saw that these methods and tools and the formation of design labs and innovation labs were popping up all across public sector institutions in Canada. So at all levels of government in Canada, I wanted to try to understand what was going on there. Why design? What was design being used to do? What were the kinds of problems that were being solved through this work? What was the role of public sector actors? And I think more broadly to try to understand what are the political implications of this work. So if design is a practice that, I think historically has been born out of industry to support the production of and styling of commodities, and more is focused on the production and styling of intangible commodities, what was it doing in public sector institutions and what kinds of problems was it trying to solve? And so that really sort of started my research. And what I did is I went around Canada and I looked at and I interviewed public servants that were doing this kind of work. And many of them had never done this kind of work before. So design was a relatively new concept to them. They had maybe done sort of an IDEO training, or they had been exposed to design through the vast network of design discourse that is obviously produced by the design industry. So blog articles and trainings and webinars and best practice guides and toolkits and all of those kinds of things, because the design industry does such a fantastic job of kind of circulating that and producing these networks of designers. And so began to start to talk to them to try to understand the kinds of design they were doing and in what ways it was coming to life. And one of the things that I found that was quite interesting is that I was able to, or found this kind of new design specialism that seemed to be emerging within public sector context in in Canada. And I termed it in my research citizen-centered design. And I know that the term citizen is problematic for a number of different reasons. And I use the term very intentionally, not to denote or to describe or to examine citizenship as a concept broadly, but to really use the idea of the citizen as a political subject, and to use that in contrast to the way that public servants were starting to view citizens as political subjects as more as consumers. And so this idea of citizen-centered design and the use of design methods to support this way of designing for a different kind of political subject, or not a political subject at all, really more of an economic subject. And so citizen-centered design was really, it's a form of innovation that serves a couple of different purposes. It's really about to improve the effectiveness and efficiency of service delivery. That was its principal aim, in the way that, at least in what I observed and researched, was about redesigning public services to facilitate self-service. So how can we remove the kinds of face-to-face interactions that maybe are traditionally associated with the public sector, at least in Canada, and have it so that the citizen was responsibilized for doing that kind of public administration work themselves, to construe public services as consumer services. And then I think this is the most important one, is to really recast that citizen-state relationship according to an economic register. And so design practices and techniques were used largely to create this kind of design specialism that ultimately resulted in these things. And as I said, one of the things that I found most interesting about this research is that design practices really, for those public servants that participated in these large-scale design projects, or they themselves became public sector designers, is that they started to view citizens in different ways. So again, if you think about, I was using the term citizen in kind of a political context, to see citizens as political actors with political needs that participate in a democratic life, etc. They started to view them more as economic subjects or consumers. And these are individuals not with political problems or issues that needed to be taken up by the state and to be considered by the state, but focused instead on very technical and pragmatic needs, what we might consider sort of like, I want to be able to renew my driver's license as quickly as possible. And so there was a shifting away from the way that public servants viewed those that were using and procuring the services that were offered by the state. So there was a bit of an interesting kind of political dynamic, and really a reconfiguration of that citizen-state relation that I mentioned. And what was interesting about this is that for the public servants that were engaged in this job, in this kind of work, this design labor, we could call it, the way that they perceived public value, so the value that was produced through the work that they were doing, was really about solving these kinds of very technical or pragmatic problems. And if they were doing that work, they were acting on the public's behalf. So it goes back to something that Jocelyn said at the outset to kind of set up this conversation. The work that they were doing was perceived as normatively good. I'm producing public value because I'm solving problems. Problems are bad, and therefore, if I use these kinds of designerly methods and practices, I'm engaged in good public sector conduct. And I thought that was a very interesting kind of shift in the way that public servants, at least in Canada, again, have traditionally perceived their role as stewards of the public interest and of public knowledge and that sort of thing. So I thought that that was kind of an interesting shift that was occurring, and the role that design was playing in facilitating these kinds of shifts. And one of the things that stood out to me, so one of the concepts that really sort of resonated and that emerged through the research that I was doing, is this idea of embedding design. So this idea of solving let me call citizen consumer subject problems, these technical problems, that was so important that the idea is that all public servants should behave in this similar kind of way, to such an extent that different levels of government introduced directives, they introduced training for public servants, they reconfigured the way that annual budgeting was done to adopt and to take up these designerly ways of working. So you were actually incentivized, to use a sort of neoliberal term, incentivized to behave as a public sector designer in the work that you do on a daily basis, because the idea of solving these citizen consumer problems was of the highest value. And so you see many different examples of that, and I sort of unpack those in some of the research that I do. So policy directives, as I said, annual plannings, as a way of trying to embed design. And what's interesting is that the idea of embedding something, or the idea of embedding design, implies that you're also replacing or displacing something else. And so when I asked public servants about this to try to understand, well, why are you embedding, or what is being displaced or replaced, was this idea of old ways of working. And this was a term that was used many times by those that I interviewed. So old ways of working, traditional ways of working, the perception of bureaucracy and red tape and friction, and that design could be introduced as a way of alleviating these things and creating a smooth, seamless, frictionless state. And again, that by extension, creating that smooth, seamless interaction between the citizen consumer and the state. So reconfiguring what that relationship looks like, again, to an economic register. So I found that to be a very kind of interesting way of looking at and thinking about the role of design and how it's being taken up, at least in Canada, in public sector institutions, and how it's often perceived as normatively good, as a good thing, that we should be doing that without ever kind of questioning the erosion of the political subjectivity of the citizen in taking up these methods and recasting them as these citizen state consumers. So I'll just pause there and open it up to any questions that folks may have about that.
I think it's interesting to think about what it means to engage with the state and engage with politics, and what expectations that sets up amongst citizens about what engaging in democratic and political life might be like.
Yeah, I think so. It's so interesting because I think it introduces a sense of taken for grantedness, right? When things are frictionless and seamless. And I mean, I would be the first to say that we were joking about this in the prep for this, is like, I don't think folks like waiting in line for, my partner just had to renew his license, and, it was a 2-hour ordeal where he had to go to a different place, and, there's long lineups because of COVID, et cetera, et cetera. So I think generally people don't want that, but the introduction of a kind of frictionless, seamless interaction with the state introduces a sort of taken for grantedness, a questioning of, I think that the benefit of introducing some friction is that you recognize the authority and control and the power that is held within the state, and that it introduces a little bit, just maybe even temporarily, a bit of critical distance for you to acknowledge that unequal power relation that exists between you and the state.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can see there's a few questions here, I think. So Justina says, it doesn't seem to be an appetite for more politically informed design versus more economically driven approaches. How might we cultivate interest in that more complicated /long/hard practice?
It's a great question. I think it's through conversations like this. I know that's a bit of a cop-out, but I think it's about introducing questioning into the process. So, like, one of the things that I do when I teach emerging designers about experience design and the role of design is to kind of look at the process that they may engage in on end to end, and begin to start to ask questions throughout that process of, like, what are the unintended consequences? So if we think about the typical double diamond, like, what voices are being excluded is sort of a basic question that you may be asking yourselves. And I think it's that kind of training and that willingness to ask those kinds of critical questions in relatively practical spaces, if that makes sense, in places where those critical questions are maybe not often heard or taken up. But I think just the ability to ask those things, those kinds of questions, I think does introduce a degree of friction, or maybe, if to borrow the Thierry's, a little bit of conflict back into what is an otherwise sort of fun. Design is fun, right? It's like, let's move on to the next sticky noting activity. Let's get into prototyping. But if we can introduce those kinds of questions, it introduces even temporarily or slightly those moments for critical reflection and criticality.
Yeah, sort of making that part of the procedure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Natalie says, I wonder how those advocating for that way of thinking deal with the paradox of red tape, preventing that way of thinking from happening, and how they overcome that red tape. I'm not sure. Natalie, do you want to just explain, if you can?
Sorry, it was like a jumble of a question, but I used to work at a university here in Austin, Texas, and something that we encountered a lot of the time was wanting to do this work and, utilize our methods of design, but we would run into the red tape within the university and within the state many of the times. So it's like, and we had people within the university that, would advocate for us, but we still ran into that red tape. So we're trying to update and redo or rethink these processes and how we work within this area, yet to remove red tape, yet we run into red tape trying to do that. So I'm like, how do you overcome that paradox or that conflict? Is it, having more people as advocates within these groups, or how do you tackle that challenge?
So the practicalities of doing design and the resistance that you might encounter, say, in the ethics review process within an academic setting, or if you wanted to introduce a method that maybe is unfamiliar within a public sector context that people are hesitant to use. Is that what you're getting at?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. I think practically speaking, if you're interested in doing research through design type activities within an academic setting, what I found to be useful is to reframe them in language and terminology that's familiar to the ethics review board. So that's just very practically how I would go about that in an academic context. And then I think in terms of doing design in a public sector context, I think it's trying to understand where your stakeholders are coming from. Like, what's their hesitancy? Why? What are the potential unintended consequences that they perceive? Can you use the methods that they're familiar with? I think one of the things that's always really important, I think, is kind of the thrust of this conversation is, why does it have to be designed? So we're trying to solve these more complex issues. And I think some of my panelists may disagree with me in this way, but why is it that design has to be at the forefront of these kinds of change programs? Like, are there other kinds of methods, or are there other forms of non-design knowledge that are just as valuable and actually should maybe be at the forefront of these kinds of processes? And I think trying to unpack that at the outset before we intervene and say, hey, design is here and it's going to do these wonderful things for you, doing that upfront understanding, I think, can go a long way. I don't know if that answers your question, Natalie, but
yes, that does. Thank you.
I just wanted to give the three of you the opportunity to, having now listened to each other, whether there are particular sort of comments or questions you'd like to ask one another, or sort of reflections on what you've heard.
I wanted to intervene about the idea of how design, what discourse of design can we tell for public institutions. For example, and I think cultural aspects is very interesting, because in Tunisia, for example, in our work, we decided that we don't speak, we don't even try to spell design. They try to, because it's very abstract, and people you confuse design with arts and cultural, and it's not really taken seriously. So the solution is how we can really talk about design without speaking or without saying the word design. So I want to know, for example, in the culture, how design is become more and more popular, and how you can tell the story of design in different other cultural contexts. What discourses, what are the practices and the tools to speak and to shape story for design to tell, specifically for political actors.
Sorry, is this a question for any one of us specifically?
Yeah, just to compare, context and.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna go ahead. I think that's a really good question, and I think that, like, obviously, and that's obvious. Of course, there are always, right, other practices that kind of existed before, design from wherever, the US or Europe, kind of like moved into places like Tunisia or whatever, that are there and you already kind of like do work. I wouldn't say that's necessarily similar, because the logics might be very different, but that do work politically, right? And again, like, there's no one definition of politics. I think that, again, that's always specific to cultural, social context. So I think that obviously, it's important to first figure out, or to understand what's there, what's existing, and the ways then also in which designers speak to these already existing, practices, for good or bad, right? Like, in some ways, designers just, kind of, I don't know, Columbus them, to use a term from the US. They just kind of like say, yeah, well, everything that's already there, you're already doing design, right? And to some extent, that's very strategic. But of course, it also kind of like eliminates the specificity of those practices that existed beforehand. So yeah, I mean, I think that's, that goes along with research reflexivity, but yeah, I mean, that's just, look what's there already. I'm sure Chad has something to say on that as well.
Yeah, and
I think it's just being clear about, because I think that there's so many different design specialisms. I think it's being very clear about the type of design that you're practicing, because I think that there are, if you're engaged in participatory design, I think the political values that underpin that set of techniques and processes that you're using are very different than the kind of managerial forms of design that I explore in my research, right? I think that the aims, the sort of the processes that are used, the way that different actors are enrolled in those processes are very different. And so I think it's just being very clear about the kind of design that you are practicing, and kind of being clear about that from the outset. Because I think with each of these different specialisms, there is a particular kind of logic and set of values that underpin them. There's a lot of blurring of them, like even social design as a container. I would describe it almost as a container of all these specialisms that kind of fold out of it. Each of those specialisms operates in different ways, and is taken up in communities in different ways. And I think it's just be important about that to acknowledge.
Yeah, and I think in some ways design is just really unhelpful. It's an unhelpfully large term that glosses an awful lot of diversity and difference, both kind of between different kinds of practice, but also between different kinds of, between different, different practices that are specific to different places and also moments in history. And I think there's a question in the chat here, Chad, about what are the old ways of working. in the UK. Our civil servants reminiscing about going back to beer and sandwiches and smoke-filled rooms. But I do think that it's interesting to, which is the point you were just making, Anka, is to actually really try and understand where certain practices come from and what the logic for them is and what the politics of them is and how they're kind of, they don't just exist in a vacuum, they're kind of sutured into a lot of different things, and they have arisen for particular reasons, and actually maybe we don't agree with those things anymore, but at least to try and be aware of what some of those connections and significances are before, like, as you said, Chad, just sort of doing away with them and replacing them with something called design, whatever that might be. Philip's got a question, and there's a couple of questions in the chat. So Philip asks,
sorry, Justin. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but I do think that's a really important question, and an important point that Brian raised, and I'd love to respond to that if possible, because I think that, and perhaps this is a bit of a challenge to you, Chad, because these forms of what you call, right, like marketization, that's not new to design. Design actually didn't introduce that at all, right? You have that in the UK, it's specific to right, like first in the 1980s Thatcher era, but then also the third way, right? Like you have new public management, and design in many ways is a reflection and critique of new public management, which came before it. And you see those, totally. And you see those practices very much still around. And so, yeah, I mean, of course, design is also building on those practices. Absolutely. I mean, how could it not? You have these kind of path dependencies without which you couldn't, move into the public sector very pragmatically, right? But at the same time, there is also very much a moving away from the kind of like expertise-based, evidence-based, right? Like very specific form of evidence, which is generated through statistics, through technical experts. And that's not the case in design. And like, this isn't, a promotion of design or like saying this is all great and we should totally adopt it. But I think that and I think that Jocelyn, you're very much, you're right. I think we do need to also be very specific in understanding, the kinds of path dependencies into which designers fit themselves and which are specific to each space. And actually, I'm not sure about Canada, but certainly in the US, that's the case, right? Like you have very much, design answers to and critiques these kinds of, right, like new public management practices. And yeah, I mean, like in the forms of right, like kind of workshops that civil servants have to take, that's not new to design. That's been there since the 80s, right? Like that's not like all like design is making use of that kind of that kind of work, right? And it's kind of like using the same mechanisms to promote its own practices, whatever they may be. So yeah, that's just Brian, I think that's a really excellent point. And
the kind of splicing together of things. And yeah. Interesting. Philip asks whether actually design for government or design by government is now getting a bad name in the UK anyway, as a result of the Homes for Ukraine programme, and how poor the scheme is and how it's been suggested that it's been designed to fail. And Becca also asks about, again, sort of thinking about how some people's experiences at the hands of the state might not be particularly great, about this question of some people have a frictionless experience of the state, but then some people experience high levels of interaction with the state and are acutely aware of power. For example, thinking of those who are overly policed or within care systems, etc., and what it means, I guess, as a designer in that context to be creating would it be a good thing to be creating a more frictionless experience? So there's a couple of questions there that I don't know if anyone wants to respond to. I'm
just reading them now.
Yeah. And then a question from Jacina as well. How do you navigate resistance to criticality, not just being the difficult person in the room or in the conversation?
I think so. Maybe if we could just take up the one question, because I think it's a really interesting one around folks that experience a lot of friction when it comes to interacting with state. So I think that's really important to consider. And I agree with that. I think we would probably all agree to some extent that many of the systems that we have or want to rely on that are offered by the state are broken in many different ways, and that individuals experience those in different ways as well. I think that where I would be cautious is what's happening, what work is being done when we are making frictionless experiences or frictionless interactions with the state. What work is actually being done? And I have to say, like, in what I've observed and what I've researched, is that a lot of that is a technique of neoliberal rationality, which is that of responsibilization. And so if you have a frictionless state and it's up to you to do your own kind of, manage your own well-being and to, do things like self-service, etc., it really is a relinquishing of the responsibility of the state to support you in living, achieving well-being, whatever that may look like for you. And again, my perspective and where I'm coming from is from Canada. So we have, take that into consideration. And so I agree with you, like, it's a delicate dance, because I would say that there's a lot that needs to be redesigned. Like, the systems, I've worked in the homelessness space, particularly with young people who've experienced homelessness. And oh my goodness, the bouncing around between systems and being dropped off once you're in child, if you've been part of the care system in Ontario specifically, where I am, and then you are at severe risk of becoming homeless, and there's no services or support to help you navigating and moving on with your life. So absolutely, there needs to be work that's done there. But I think that work needs to be done in a trauma-informed way. I think that the lived experts that are part of that need to be at the center of it. And I guess what I would come down to is, in the research that I have done, and again, this is the Canadian context, is that there's a lot of talk about the democratization of decision-making, co-designing policy, co-creation of services, etc. And there's actually not a lot of evidence that that's actually happening on the ground. I think that these techniques are used as a way of suggesting that this is how this process is going to be would unfold. But when you actually go in to look at sort of case examples of what's happening on the ground, there's not a lot of evidence that the opinions of the so-called users of these services are actually being taken into consideration in the design of whatever is produced in the long run. And so I think it's just very important to kind of temper the potential emancipatory power of design and how it can be used as a democratizing force and all these kinds of things. I want to believe that, and I buy into that, but I don't know, at least in the Canadian context, that there's a lot of evidence to support that claim.
I want to respond to Chad for that, because maybe the results are frustrating, because the results, and when you see how artifacts and how the results of the process are very deceiving, but I think that the activities of the design has this embodied, democratic culture in those, in how activities, in how prototyping is, for example, an activity where decision making is very, there's no hierarchy in decision making. We try to do this, and when, for example, in workshops, you see that users express themselves and they redefine the uses and the conditions, and I think that the power of, in my case, of the design, it's still in its process more than the artifacts that they deliver. So you see that in our practices, in workshops, in activities, in how we designally we do even the inquiry in the fieldwork. But then when there is this institutional, implementation of the solution, that comes another level of complexity and another level of power that try to also to maybe manipulate how things are done from the beginning, which is very frustrating.
Yeah, as I completely agree with you. I think that there are always, right, like if you come at this from the perspective that everything that's being advocated for is actually being implemented, that seems, you know, unworkable in any kind of practice. I mean, to design, obviously, but like any other kind of practice as well, right? Like the promises of like new public management, for instance, which was, you know, heralded as this new awesome thing that could, you know, like totally like revolutionize the public sector. They didn't come true either. I mean, the promises are always more than what comes out at the end. And I think that's just, I mean, that's, you know, kind of a truism. And I do want to point out, and something I think Azar that you touched upon, that Chad, you also mentioned, but in a very different way from Azar, is that, Chad, for you, it seems that the technical and the political are two completely different things. And the technical is something that, you know, ostensibly is bad, and the political is something that's good. But like, I just want to like, that's the logic, right, of these forms of theories, especially like the critique of neoliberalism, which you promote, or which you seem to be building upon, which if I misunderstood, please do correct me. But I think that's really important, in what you pointed out, that there seems to be some connection that the political and the technical are always entangled, and design kind of like makes that visible in a way that is, you know, if not necessarily positive or great or awesome, is at least very interesting in the sense that that's perhaps something that's quite unique about it. I'm not saying that other practices don't do that, but perhaps not as, I don't know, generally, or not as, yeah, they're not as prominent globally, you know, for better or worse. But yeah, I think that's a really good point, as a
design as a revealer of relationship dynamics. And
yeah, and that in democracy one also always needs technical things, right? Like one always needs these technical and instrumental mechanisms. Without that, you don't have anything political, and you don't have democracy either.
But I think it's the over-privileging of those things, right? And I think what you see here, again, at least what I've observed, is that these design processes are really used as a way of neutralizing the kinds of political conversations and contestation that really should be at the heart of the democratic decision-making processes. So design is used and unfolded as a way of, let's gather everyone together in a room and go through a structured design process. And through this process, we'll arrive at some kind of a consensus based on a sticky noting activity or something like that. And in doing that, what you're doing is bracketing off the real conversations that need to be had around what are the trade-offs that we're willing to make as a community. For instance, around, you know, in Canada, we've experienced long-term austerity at all levels of government. And so is the question about rationing services, or actually should we be talking about that we need to raise taxes and we need to invest in public services, and that the state needs to be more proactive in the nurturing and safeguarding of public goods, whether those be the kinds of services that people access or the public goods that might be otherwise associated with democratic life. And so I think what you see, though, in practice, as it plays out on the ground, when these publics that are formed through these workshops or designerly processes, etc., they're very carefully orchestrated to eliminate that political content from the discussion. And I think that's where my critique exists. It's not to say that the political and the technical are not entangled. Absolutely they are. And we do need these technical instruments to live in a democratic life. 100% agree with that. I think it's the privileging of the kinds of discourses that unfold within those situated environments. They're not necessarily political conversations that are being brought to the fore. It's really a matter of, do you want a green button or a blue button? Do you want to receive a response within 24 hours or 48 hours? Not to kind of step back from it and to say, do we need this service in the first place? Why do we have this service? Why are people having to access this service that's offered by the state? Is there some other policy decision that could be made upstream to prevent having to create the service in the first place. And so for me, it's those kinds of political exchanges that are missing from this. And I think it's, in practical terms, it's hard to do that if, as a public servant, you're not asked to participate. You're not asked to do, you're asked to do public consultation, but you really want to know, like, should it be a blue button or a green button? And so I think for me, just to kind of respond to your previous sort of comment around these are not new things, 100% agree. I would say that the introduction of design processes and methods exacerbates new public management techniques. Absolutely, they were brought into the state as a way of introducing managerial forms of work, etc. And I think they've actually been quite successful in many ways of incubating neoliberal values within the public sector. And I think design sort of exacerbates that. And the last thing that I would say, or I think the evidence to support that claim, is like, what is the index that's currently used for appropriate public sector conduct? It's the private sector, it's consulting firms, it's Deloitte, it's McKinsey, it's PwC. Looking to these firms as appropriate forms of public sector conduct. And I think it's important for us just to be mindful of that and to ask questions about that, or to engage in a critical debate about that. That's all.
But again, that's not new to design at all. Those firms were in the public sector for decades. So it's not but that's the thing, is like, it doesn't actually introduce, I mean, again, like I agree with you, right? Like, but what you're suggesting, right? First of all, you're suggesting that there's a kind of primacy to politics, that politics always looks one way, that it needs to be a kind of conflictual situation, which I think, yes, that's one way of looking at politics completely. But perhaps maybe you're expecting a little bit too much of it, right? Like, what you're suggesting is an alternative to representative democracy, which I'm all for, right? But like, I wonder if design is ever able to do that. And this is something that you already suggested, but like, is that not asking too much of it? Because I don't think that designers or design discourses ever presented themselves, as an alternative for, right, representative democracy. Because these kinds of questions, you're right, need to be raised in the public debate. But do they need to be raised in design conversations? I'm not sure. Maybe not. Could these kind of like design practices become a little bit more, right, like looking more at the decisions or questions or goals that want to be asked further upstream? I mean, sure, but again, like, you're totally right. Like, these public servants, they're not necessarily enabled to do these kind of things or ask these kinds of questions, because they need to, like, they have their bosses sitting on them, right? Like, they have a certain amount of time. They especially in the US, they're not asked to ask these kind of questions. Nobody wants them to ask these kind of questions, because otherwise they're going to have Congress on them, right? Like, they're going to be dragged before Congress, and nobody wants that, right? So again, like, what you're asking is, I think, that a much more systemic problem, and we should be discussing that kind of problem, which is what we're doing right now. But I do wonder if, like, the kind of expectation that one has of design isn't actually way too big for that, right? Like, and I mean, I actually don't totally agree that, like, designers always orient themselves on the private sector practices. That was certainly true in the beginning, like, totally. I don't think that's necessarily the case in the middle. Most of the public servants that I spoke to in the US, they like read, like, decolonial design. They're much more in tune and aware of what's, being discussed in critical design discourses than I think that maybe, you've given them credit for right now. I mean, not to defend, people in the public service. I mean, maybe to defend them, because actually most of them are really great people. But I do wonder if maybe that, like, idea that there is a kind of marketization overdetermines a little bit, how we read design, because I think that there's really complex.
It's also just to kind of interject. It's also possibly to do with a moment in time, and the moment in time that Chad and I were both looking at simultaneously in the UK and Canada, and what was going on at a particular moment in time, and political fashions and political trends for fashionable ideas change. Things do move quite quickly, and we have, in the last 2 or 3 years, seen quite a big shift in terms of how aware people are of the need to recognise diversity and processes of colonization, and all of those things have become, people were not talking about that, well, they were talking about it a little bit, but I think when we were both doing our field work, that just wasn't, you know, that was not a discussion particularly. And also, and when you look at the sort of the discourse and the you know, the kinds of texts that were being written, I guess you know, the things that I was talking about in the beginning, that those early sort of advocacies for design in the early 2000s, they are much more situated in a kind of, you know, aligning themselves with a sort of McKinsey type practice. So it's also perhaps, again, I think it's very easy to use the word design and to somehow like assume we're talking about the same thing when we might be talking about quite different things.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But yeah. So I'm just going to see if there's. I wondered if actually I might just sort of bring it back to where we started, which is this question of how do you think critically about what design is busy doing in this space? As a researcher and as a designer, and I mean, it'd be interesting if you could each just say a little bit about actually just the sort of the nuts and bolts of your method, like how you've gone about doing research, but also, and there's quite a sort of more conceptual question from Patrizia, which is just about, is it possible to think deeply about what the sort of the consequences of design interventions in complex and political systems as designers, or is that actually something that necessarily has to be reserved for, well, she said designer, researcher, philosophers, sort of hyphens between them. And what is the relationship between a critical research perspective and practice? So that's several questions bundled into one there, but but maybe actually just so we can go, maybe end on that one because that's quite a juicy one. But just if you could say a little bit, just for some of the, I guess some of the people on this call might be early career researchers or PhD students, and just to talk in like slightly more pragmatic terms about what did you actually do, like how did you go about doing your research? I don't know if somebody wants to go first.
I will go first. I think that in my case, in my research, when it was very strategic for me to choose the more convenient field work or cities or territory in which I want to begin my work. And for example, it was, you know, the appetite for experiments and for design and for innovation. And it was very strategic for me. It was very interesting for me to choose territories, and I began with municipalities that accepted this kind of work, to experiment with them, to learn from them. And just something to begin with, you know, something that makes it allow you to have, you know, small réussite, so quick wins, so that you can continue work and you know the system and have this, you know, exploratory research to begin with, and then there you can you know try to map out some networks, some relationships from which you can start and build again, and also having this progressive works and evaluating work where when you adapt your discourse, your posture, your position, yourself, your identities with the community. And I think just try to begin where you can begin to intervene, and just to demonstrate through quick wins, and then let's see. Just pragmatic question answer.
Okay, and so that's quite probably I guess quite different than to how Chad, you and Anka, you have gone about doing your research. Is it, or is it not? Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, so for me, I'm interested in the situated accounts of folks that are engaged in this work in practice. So I find for me methodologically, like interviews and observation tend to be the best way of kind of going about doing that. And then the other thing that I find, like the thing that I'm very interested in right now is design labor. So looking at the role of designers as, you know, producers of labor, and what is that labor and all that kind of stuff. So those are sort of that's the research stream that I'm going down right now, and the things that I'm thinking about.
And Anka, what's your process or your method?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, it's both very historical work, archival work primarily, as well as, you know, contemporary fieldwork, interviews, but also, you know, oral history interviews, that kind of stuff. So I do try to work, you know, always with the present in mind, and with, you know, having the present practices, you know, as the kind of background for the archival, for the genealogical work. And that kind of like goes back between the historical documents and the contemporary, right, like contemporary field work, and looking at what's, you know, what is being foreshadowed, or what have people done before that is similar to today, what are possible links and connections, but also what are the absences, right? Like what perhaps has gotten lost along the way, right? That perhaps might be useful. Or maybe sometimes not. Maybe it's good sometimes that things got lost along the way, and things change.
And are there particular archives that you have been working with, or?
Yeah, I mean, I was very lucky that I've inherited the archives of this one German systems science research group, which was, you know, dissolved, and so I kind of like came into possession of that, which was really great, and a lucky find. And I went to the University of California, Berkeley, for my PhD research, and I did a lot of research in the archives. I'm actually planning a research trip to the RAND archives in fall, as well as to the Stanford Research Institute archives in California, and yeah, in fall this year. So that kind of like, that's the kind of work that I'm doing.
Yeah, it's interesting just thinking about, if you're not studying the contemporary, I mean, it's one thing finding contemporary sites to study, but if you're trying to, like, a lot of this stuff might not necessarily be captured very obviously. So finding ways of studying even quite recent history. I mean, I've been trying to write about the sort of discourse over the last 20 years, and lots of things that I was aware of at the time as a practitioner being published have now just sort of, you know, disappeared out of the, you know, the web pages disappear, or things. So actually kind of capturing, finding your data, capturing things is an interesting challenge, I think, in this field. So maybe just like a last thought on Patricia's question, which is about, I mean, maybe I'll just put this really reductively, but what does a critical research perspective have to offer, or how does it translate, or how to practice? I know there's more than one question in her question that she submitted, but I'm just gonna and the answer could be like not maybe nothing.
Jocelyn, I just want to reflect on my culture as a graphic designer, which is about, you know, it used to be about branding and visibility. And there's another paradigm, which is representation. So representation versus visibility, which is not the same thing. So the representation for me, it was a mean of not a dialogic, you call mean to reflect with the community and with the people and with the participants about the emergence of the fieldwork. So for me, representation, it's not just making materiality or visual materiality about data or about learnings. It's also establishing an environment for conversation, for discussion, and for also letting people express themselves through different ways. So, for example, representation was me as it was mean and a tool for reflexivity and for collective reflexivity, let's say that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And do you, Chad, do you have any?
Yeah, I think it's sort of, I think for me anyways, like, and I think about my own practice, I think there's real value in having critical practitioners. So folks out doing design work in these institutions and systems, which I think many of the folks that are joining us today want to see reform or change or whatnot. And I think an ability to think critically and use theory and to have conversations and dialogues like this, and then to bring that back into the work that you're doing on a daily basis, I think is invaluable. Is it going to be fast? Absolutely not. But I think the more we can have a cohort of critical practitioners out in the world doing design, acting in these systems, I think that there's real, I think that brings the possibility of change and that kind of reconfiguration of these systems that I think a lot of folks are looking for.
Yeah, I agree. Anka, do you have any last thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I agree with both, you know, Azar and Chad on that point. I mean, I'm not a practitioner, you know, despite the fact that I have a background in design, I don't understand myself, as you noted in the beginning. I don't understand myself as a designer, and I don't practice it, certainly. I think that for me, what I'm hoping to do is, with the kind of like research that I'm doing, is, you know, to complicate the story, you know, that designers tell themselves, but also to, you know, speak back to the academy and the ivory tower, which, you know, generally kind of like denounces design, you know, or kind of like dismisses it as oh, it's just another, you know, just another form of neoliberalism. Hence my very strong critique to you, Chad, or my very strong response, because this is like this immediate impulse of very critical sort of academics, critical social researchers, that like everything's just, you know, dismissed as just another form of neoliberalism by that means. And I think that there's a real specificity to design. And never mind that, I think that everything that you said about everything, you know, all your critique of it, Chad and Azar, completely correct. I think it's absolutely right. And yet I think that there is a specificity to it that I think we need to take seriously as if forms of, or potential forms of new political practice. And maybe they're nascent, maybe they're always going to be nascent, maybe they're never going to actually come to fruition, but I think there's something really interesting in that. So for me, this form of critique also needs to speak back to the academy so that it's not just the ivory tower. And I think that there's a real importance in the connection between critical practice and you know, critical social research that I think has perhaps gotten lost too much in the last, I don't know, 30 years.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and yes, I completely agree with that as well. Okay, so we've gone to about 2 minutes over. So I'm going to wrap us up because I know we've said we were going to finish at 4, and probably people have got other things to do now with the rest of their day or the rest of their afternoon. I just wanted to say thank you so much, Anka and Chad and Azar, for sharing your work with us and for engaging in this conversation. And thank you everybody else who joined us and participated and submitted some really great questions.